So the new U.S. Soccer Federation has a new boss. His name is Carlos Cordeiro. Everybody knows about it now. I mean, the news has been around for a few days. And, I'm like really terribly excited about it because, I think it's great that you put another finance guy out there, especially from Goldman Sachs, because that's where everything comes down to. You buy a team and you immediately qualify as a specialist if you own some sort of a franchise, and then you realize that you know crap about the game, and all of a sudden you need to hire people who give you good advice. And if you don't hire people that give you good advice, then you end up being relegated, which is pretty typical of, a lot of new owners, the nouveau riche, as they say, people who buy teams, for example, in England, and you think they know the soccer or the league that they're buying into. They hire coaches that they think they're good, and then they end up being relegated. Well, that's not really the big news, because the big news really overall is what Carlos Cordeiro represents and whom. Now, before, his faction of people who are going to vote for him were not necessarily a large portion. He wasn't getting a large percentage of the vote. He was sort of splitting it with Kathy Carter, who was an establishment candidate, someone who worked for SUM, for MLS, and somebody who had Don Garber and Sunil Gulati behind her. There was obviously some sort of a group that was against it, simply because she represented the biggest status quo of all status quos. So she was not going to be popular, probably even after being elected, had she been elected. Carlos Cordeiro is an unknown quantity. He was kind of just a money guy. He was involved in negotiating contracts. He wasn't involved in running the organization where Sunil Gulati was. What is kind of odd in this scenario is where Cordeiro went from being kind of a leader, but really kind of a part of the two-headed race, to where he became a dominant leader and one going away. And many attribute that to his courting of the U.S. Player Council. There are about 20 U.S. players that contribute to the decision-making. They have a voting bloc. Or I guess they didn't have to vote as a bloc, but they voted as a bloc. And no one says what exactly Cordeiro promised to those players. And, knowing how things work, it's quite obvious to me that there was some sort of promise being made behind the scene in order for Stu Holden to come out and be extremely ecstatic about his choice. Maybe he says, hey, do you guys want some jobs with organization? Or, the USSF is sitting on $100 million. Please, cut yourself a nice chunk of the cake and we'll be all happy. So that's certainly a possibility. On the other hand, Carlos Cordeiro has money of his own as somebody who had gone up pretty high Goldman Sachs pyramid, and was a managing director, was an international consultant. And those people can make really good money. Where Sunil Gulati is just an economic professor, and economic professor could make about $100,000 a year. And so he heavily depended on his lifestyle, on travel, on 5-star meals and 5-star hotels and limousines from MLS and from organizing committees. In other words, his money, his lifestyle was dependent upon people who already had, the Robert Krafts and Merritt Paulson, and people who comprised MLS ownership groups. Carlos ought to be far less beholden to those groups. He may not be a full independent millionaire. We don't know his net worth, but he seems to be certainly capable of maintaining the 5-star hotel, 5-star restaurant style on his own. So he doesn't need that sort of a little side type of a beneficial agreement with MLS. So that's good. In other words, he doesn't have to do what Sunil Gulati did over the last year and a half, 2 years, which is what caused the demise of the U.S. qualification campaign and its inability to qualify for the World Cup. And this brings it to a bigger point here, and that is we have what I would call a Continental Divide. Now, what is a Continental Divide? Well, it simply, to me, is the difference between the players who are based in Europe, on a different continent, thus the Continental Divide, and players who are based in the United States, and coaches who are based in the United States. What happened with Jürgen Klinsmann was that Jürgen Klinsmann became very unpopular with MLS ownership. He was very unpopular with Don Garber, was very unpopular with those who thought he was being negative and his evaluation of U.S. soccer scene, especially of MLS, was low. And that he recommended that all prospects that want to aspire to anything and everything go to Europe, because that's where the biggest clubs are. And then once you get to Europe, you try to work up the pyramid, because not, most youth players will go to youth academies or go to smaller clubs, and then you try to work hard, and so you become eventually purchased by or promoted into the top league. That is not something MLS wanted. MLS considered Klinsmann to be very much politically incorrect. Although Klinsmann was very politically correct overall. But the situation is that, of course, Klinsmann grew up in a very competitive environment, and that environment meant that you don't settle for a smaller team, for a smaller club, if you could make it to a bigger team, to a bigger club. And of course, Klinsmann, whose parents own a small bakery, did have these aspirations, did have the drive, and went from Stuttgart, which was a popular but not huge club at the time, to Inter Milan. He went to Monaco, he went to Tottenham, he went to Bayern. So he played across the globe, well, across Europe at least, Western Europe. And he got to the point where he understood what it takes to become a great player, because everybody around him who was a great player, and the Germans won, or at least at the time was West Germans who won the World Cup, and Germany won the Euros in '96. This was a bunch of really motivated guys. Remember, some of them in '96 even came from East Germany, which merged with West Germany to become the Germany. And so those players really wanted to show that they're as good as the top global players, because in East Germany they couldn't do that. They were constrained by the old communist government. And so Klinsmann, who played in Italy, played for one of the, in Inter Milan, which was one of the best teams at the time, played for Monaco, which was one of the best teams in France, in the French league, and for Tottenham, which wasn't one of the best teams, but certainly a competitive team where he won Player of the Year, realized that's what it takes to become a great national team, or a good national team. You need players who have ambitions, who want to try to improve themselves, and yes, there is money involved, so they want to make more money with better teams, but they also want to play on better teams for the sheer joy of the game, and for the fact that they're playing against Messi in the Champions League, or they're playing here, or they're playing there. That's not what MLS is about. MLS historically has decided that soccer is better served playing at home. Even though the league itself wasn't very good, even though it wasn't coaching the players to be very good, and even though the players themselves had no aspirations of becoming very good, the motivation of MLS owner was making money. And they did not want to lose their top prospects to Europe. In other words, they did not want Christian Pulisic to go to Dortmund free of charge. They did not want Josh Sargent to go to Europe free of charge. They did not want Jordan Morris to go to Europe free of charge. And they considered Klinsmann's general state, his attitude toward the game, to be counterproductive to the well-being of MLS. They felt, with some degree of justification, that they put a lot of money into MLS. They've put hundreds of millions, they've lost a lot of money over the years, and now they deserve to get some sort of a reward. They deserve to have a coach who's going to be part of the collective. Someone who say, yeah, we are Americans and we can do it because we're Americans. And that created a divide. Now, in 2006, when the United States finished last in its group, Bruce Arena, who was then the head coach and then soon dismissed by Gulati, well, contract wasn't renewed, felt the same way as Klinsmann. He felt American players have to go to Europe. American players have to become better. And for the most part, Bruce Arena rewarded players who wanted to go to Europe. He did not reward players who were happy to sit on the couch in their home in Colorado. The big example, or two fairly big examples, were Joe Cannon, who was the best goalkeeper in MLS at the time, and probably better, or at least as good, as players like Marcus Hahnemann, who was at the time playing for Reading. Joe Cannon was more athletic. He was more athletic. He had a great. He was a great shot stopper. Bruce Arena loathed the fact that Joe Cannon had a year or half a year at Lens in France, and then came home because he just didn't want to play in Europe. And that wasn't good enough. Bob Bradley didn't play Bobby Convey after Bobby Convey came back from Europe. Everything from Arena and Bradley for a long time, and justifiably so in my opinion, was centered on young players with potential who wanted to go out and prove themselves. And that is just any kind of a basic motivation. It happens pretty much in every sport. If you look at, and I read sometimes about the Russian hockey players, and they say, well, look, if the players want to go out and prove themselves, in order for us to have the best national team, a national hockey team, the players ought to be performing every day in an NHL. NHL is the best hockey league. That's where they have to go and play. Well, there's a lot of money in Russia, held in very few hands, but there's a lot of money in Russia. And a lot of these players come back to Russia to play in the KLH, which is the Continental Hockey League, for huge wages. Additionally, because the Russian income tax is very low, it's 13%. So you're making $7 million a year, you're essentially getting $6 million take home, and plus whatever other money may be delivered there in suitcases and gold coins. The European basketball players feel the same way about their best, the Croatians and the Russians and the Spaniards and so on. They want them to play in the NBA. They want NBA, but they know that NBA is the best league, so they want their players competing day in, day out in the best league in the world. Well, that's not how it works with MLS. MLS thinks, and its MLS owners have thought for a long time, that their league is as good. They have no reason to think that. The wages that MLS teams pay are pretty much kind of a third tier of Europe. In other words, they're not English Premier League or the Bundesliga. They're not even Championship. They're pretty much like League One quality, about $250,000 a year. So when you're in the global market and you're paying low wages, you're going to have the team quality commensurate with whatever money you pay. But that wasn't good enough for them with regard to Klinsmann. Klinsmann was pro-Europe. He was pro-overseas team. He was pro-Bundesliga. He was for the APL. And not only was that the case, which was, of course, 100% true, Jurgen Klinsmann wanted his players to go for the best teams. In other words, even if you get bought by Fulham, he wanted those guys to go and try to play for Tottenham, was the case with Clint Dempsey. And if you go play, for Bayer Leverkusen, like Landon Donovan was, you want him to go and try to play for Bayern. If you're Mönchengladbach, you try to play for better teams, better, bigger, better paying, more competitive, higher quality teams. That is, once again, a given. Now, remember, in the United States, with its cap structure, which is true about MLS, there is really no difference, or not much difference, between different teams. In other words, LA Dodgers have like a $250 million payroll, so of course, but, it's baseball, so you kind of play on an individual basis. And in basketball, the difference between the top paying teams and the lowest paying teams is somewhere about 2 to 1. The Lakers paying like $100 million, and the teams on the bottom, like Milwaukee or Minnesota, whatever, Minneapolis, they pay about $50 million. So yes, there is some difference, and the difference is mostly on the low end versus the very high. In other words, the Lakers have a couple of superstars, and Minnesota have more, players on the bottom who are kind of marginal players. But otherwise, you're kind of playing in the same league with the same type of players, for the bulk of the team is the same type of players, both with the Lakers and, for example, the Minnesota Vikings, I don't know, whatever their name is. But it's different in Europe. In Europe, or really for that matter globally with the exception of MLS, is that if you go to our top teams, you are paying with better players because the average wages at a top tier EPL club is probably somewhere around $8 million to $10 million a year, where the average wage in EPL overall is probably somewhere at $4 million a year. So you go into this environment and you're immediately competing against the big time superstars. I mean, you go to Tottenham, you go to Manchester City, you go to well, AC Milan isn't where it used to be, but you go to these clubs like Barcelona. Of course, the whole aim just to get there is prestige. You can always tell your ancestor, your kids, not to say even the media, that you played at some point at a very big club, that you aspire to be the best, and you accomplish most of your goals. But MLS does not have that type of movement. The teams are capped. They have capped wages. And so if you're playing in Chicago, you're playing in New England, if you're playing in Dallas, if you're playing in Portland, you have the same type of a team. Yes, some teams have much higher wages because they've brought up their, the superstar names. Not the superstar players, but the superstar names. Players who are once upon a time great players. But they're bringing in players who simply had record of great performance, but they're bringing them in their mid-30s, in some occasions late 30s. So while you have players with discernible skills and certainly the brain to be a star, most of those players don't have the physical abilities of what they once had. So for the most part, you're buying them for marketing purposes. Andrea Pirlo, who was a great player in his prime, couldn't even get off the bench with New York FC, which I thought was a force of Patrick Vieira, but he nonetheless wanted to sit Pirlo. And so here's the guy making $6 million a year. He's not even playing. He gets in for a few minutes every other game. So in MLS, it doesn't matter where you play. The teams don't buy you. They can trade you for a draft pick, or they can cut you, or they can trade you because you're making too much money. Now remember, in global soccer, there is no such thing as too much money. There's too much money compared to performance. If you're a great player, you're going to go up. You're going to go up. Teams don't cut players because they're too good. In MLS, remember Eddie Pope or Josh Wolf or some other players get cut because they're making too much money. They're too good. You need to fit in the entire roster in a very limited cap space, and that's a big difference. So you basically, an MLS player is basically paid not to be any good. He's paid to be just like everyone else. So basically, he's paid to be the part of the scene. Now, over the years, this has changed somewhat with various sort of exceptions and off-payroll and off-budget type of contracts, such as DP and TAM, target allocation money. Nonetheless, there is a cap. People talk about glass ceiling. Well, MLS is that glass ceiling, and a ceiling made of glass or cement, concrete, is very low. In other words, when you become very good in MLS, you're still probably going to be entitled to like $1 million a year, maybe a little more, or they just, won't pay you. Now you can leave and try, go somewhere as a free agent, but it's not a great chance either, because you're going to be a mediocre player and you're going to be an older mediocre player. And of course, most European teams, most global teams want young mediocre players with the hope that they can lift them to a decent level and then sell them on. Now, if you come in if you're 26, 27, it's very difficult under market conditions to sell somebody, who's 30 to 31. They lose their value. And if they're mediocre and older, they have no value. They pretty much play in a year-to-year contract. And if you're good, you sign another contract. And as soon as you have a bad year, adios, you're done. So that's the mentality of European soccer, global soccer really as a whole, because Brazil or Argentina or Mexico, they're not capped, so good players get sold, good players get transferred, good players go to bigger teams, bigger clubs, and then the national teams, you stuff with guys like Messi and Aguero and Higuain and Dybala, and the coach says, well, I can't play Dybala or Aguero because I want to play Higuain and Messi. Now you think about what an embarrassment of riches, what an embarrassment of talent these teams have, to where, if you're somebody like, I go to Brazil, like Oscar or Willian, you can't get into a starting lineup. You're playing for Chelsea and, you're a talented player, but you don't have the starting spot. Well, Oscar went to China. So that's a big problem. Now, Klinsmann became sort of the poster child of the divide because he was a German or European, which is Germany is in Europe, in case you didn't know. Because he was a European coach, European player. He came in, an American citizen and married to an American lady and has American kids and so on and so forth. But because he was European, he became this negative, he sort of embodied this negative stereotype of what a foreigner might look like. It was American player, American coach, fell in line with his bosses, and his bosses are in MLS. American coach, and this is important, has no options of going to Europe. Bob Bradley was a rare exception because he coached for teams that had connections to American money, ownership. So he coached at Swansea, he coached Egypt, he got through a trainer. But for the most part, American coaches, especially given Bob Bradley's experience and success or lack thereof, is not going to go and play in Europe or coach in Europe because nobody's going to hire you to be a top-level coach. And the reason Bob Bradley got hired was because he was a national team coach for, about 4 years, 7, 8, 9, 11. And because he had connections, especially connections to American money. So he went to Europe. He did okay in Norway. He did okay in France. He just completely fell apart and, lost his face in England because obviously there's a big difference between Norwegian top league, which is essentially like League One, or French second league, which is like League One, and EPL, which is like 3 steps higher. Well, it's 2 steps higher, but the money is so big and the coaching is so inferior. Bob Bradley couldn't handle it. He couldn't handle a top quality team, and a top quality means the EPL team. But because of that, the only way a young American coach can go to Europe is to essentially go in for free. Most people won't hire him. So you need some sort of a connection, and maybe maybe Cordero can establish some sort of connection. Now, there are all sorts of financial connection between American club and a British club, or American club and a German club, or American club and a Spanish club. They go there and they train and they go back, and that's it. So they don't learn anything in a week. I mean, you pretty much have to go there and study, and pick up all the nuances of the game, which they don't care about. So it's hard for an American coach to go overseas. And pretty much for the last 20 years, almost, MLS owners were recalcitrant in bringing in European coaches to coach in MLS. It's pretty much, unfortunately, been an good old boys network. Ziggy Schmidt, he coached here, he moves there, and then he coached there. I mean, he's in his 4th club in MLS, even though he's been fired. Well, he's been fired 3 times. And so you have these coaches like Wilmer Cabrera and Ziggy Schmidt and Bob Bradley and Bruce Arena. They kept going around. Now you see the difference for someone like Tata Martino can make, where he comes in, and I don't think he fully understands what MLS says yet. But he comes in from Argentina. He comes in having coached in several continents. He coached for Barcelona. Not very well, but he wasn't horrible. And so he comes in and immediately can see Atlanta playing differently than other clubs. Now, they had some injuries, they had some players, and I'm sure he doesn't understand what MLS says yet. I mean, he's playing 4-2-3-1, which is his scheme, even though the weakest point in MLS is their defense, because most money goes to players, to attacking players, most go to forwards and strikers, wingers, and so on and so forth. So Tata Martino, and I'm going, this is a little sideway, does have to learn to understand, because MLS does have its own peculiarities as a league. Now, what Martino did poorly, in my opinion, was that he played a 4-2-3-1 scheme with a single striker against defenses that had very little talent overall. So it's sort of like saying in the NFL, You have a team, you're playing against another team that has great linebackers and is good against the run, but terrible secondary. So the first thing you think, well, you got to pass the ball because that's, why go against the strength of the defense when you have recognized its weaknesses? Well, Tata Martino doesn't seem to recognize its weaknesses or weaknesses of MLS clubs, which is huge for a coach because you have to be able to understand where you are, where you stand, and who your opposition is. Well, he didn't. So that's a problem. Now, having said that, he's still a pretty decent coach. And if he goes to the international team, if he goes to coach the United States, he will have to figure out where the American strengths are and where the opposition's strengths and weaknesses are. And then I'm sure he'll make the required adjustments. Nonetheless, Tata Martino is an anomaly. Over the years, MLS has been prone to hiring domestic coaches. Now, some of these coaches have played in Europe. For the most part, they're kind of old college coaches who become assistant, who become this, who become that, and is stewing in their own sauce. And the only improvement that came into MLS over the years wasn't in terms of its coaching, now with the exception of Martino. And then there are some other guys like Remy Garbin and Real. The only improvement that came to MLS was from imported players. So MLS on one hand says, oh, we got to be proud, we got to be American, we got to be all for American. On the other hand, they're bringing in foreign players. So you have teams like Portland, and you look at their 11-man starting lineup, they might have one or two American-born American players who can play for the American national team, for the U.S. national team. Otherwise, they have either players that came in to the United States early, got their green cards, and then they keep bringing in more and more players. So there's really, it's a league that pretends to be American, but realize that in order to be financially successful, it needs to bring in inexpensive foreign players. Well, the problem here is that they're bringing in players for $250,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. Now, that kind of money, once again, you bring in average, mediocre players who are perhaps English championship level. Perhaps. Now, the worst case here is that American players, the ones who that were drafted or went through academy, don't even get to play. They're not, in other words, they're not as good as these inexpensive foreign imports. Now, that's the problem. Most teams dedicate a coaching staff to bring in young talent and to coach them to a higher level. MLS fails them. That's the reason you see American players at Trinidad and Tobago in some places, and who's scoring? What's Christian Pulisic? He's the guy who was coached well. I mean, what did he score? Like 40% of U.S. goals in the qualifying? And then Bobby Wood scored another. So MLS just simply isn't there. And the worst thing is, it isn't that MLS isn't there. It pretends that it is. And how to pretend it? It pretended so by firing Jürgen Klinsmann, that European joie de vivre, or Weltanschauung, whatever it's a German phrase. So they fire Klinsmann, I should say. Well, at first they had to hire him. They fire Klinsmann and they appoint Arena. They appoint Arena because they know they have to have an American coach. Why? Well, because they want to prove to the world they're as good as the Europeans. Now, they go to these CONCACAF meetings, the CONCACAF matches, the CONCACAF Champions League, and they constantly, year in, year out, fold to Mexico. Now, Mexico is not a top league. It's probably like around 20th, 25th in the world. United States is probably another 10 spots below, 15 spots below. I mean, it gets pretty tight. It doesn't really matter as much where, who's there. Denmark or the United States. I would say Denmark, but Americans been buying, bigger, better players. Denmark been selling their better players. So what happens is that Bruce Arena needed to become the figurehead. He needed to become the figurehead of the U.S. soccer. He needed to become the face of U.S. soccer. The same way Landon Donovan was the face of U.S. soccer and the face of MLS. You needed an American face for marketing purposes. You need an American face to market MLS. And so what happened that was, it was the second half of that Continental Divide, because Bruce Arena is essentially not only a liar and an incompetent coach, he is personally offensive to a lot of Europeans, especially having said in the past that Americans are just as good and Europeans don't really want to play for the flag, blah, blah, blah. He insulted players. And so the players felt that. Timmy Chandler, Daniel Williams, Jermaine Jones, Jeff Cameron, who's, of course, American born and raised, but playing in England. The players felt that. The players felt insulted. They felt that they were not given a fair share, a fair shake, really, because it was Arena who was saying that, I don't care if you play in England, I don't care if you play in Germany, we're going to do it our way, we're going to do it with American players. Now, of course, it did bring Pulisic, because even idiot like Arena would know that without Christian Pulisic, they were pretty certain to go down. But he did drop. He did not never call up Daniel Williams, who was playing or moved to Huddersfield in Premier League. He didn't call up Timothy Chandler, and then other players got hurt. And this is what led to the U.S. not qualifying. He did not call up best players. And furthermore, of course, he was inept tactically and technically and strategically. In other words, he put in together lineups and schemes that were completely unsuitable to the talent he did have. I mean, he's a loser. I mean, Bruce Arena is not only is he a loser, one of those worst, horrible human beings there is. And nonetheless, I'll go on. The divide between European American players, European-based American players, even some are dual nationals, and MLS-based American players is going to go further. And it's going to take Cordero or a new coach to eliminate that bridge, because the only reason MLS has been, U.S. national team has been successful in the last few years, and whatever successes it did have, was heavily due to the presence of the call them Germericans, of the German-born, raised players like Jermaine Jones, to some extent like Jonathan Brooks, and Fabian Johnson. Well, Bruce Arena couldn't use those guys. Bruce Arena felt that Jorge Villafaña, who was starting or sometimes not starting for Santos Laguna, which is like 3 steps below European League, that he was good enough, that Amar Gonzalez was good enough. That was his boys, and Bruce Arena was part of the Good Old Boys Network. The Good Old Boys Network essentially rejected the Europeans, not because the Europeans were bad, but because they thought the Americans were as good, which is almost the same type of accusation you can levy against those guys. Levy is something else. And so that is the main problem. And I've said it many times over. People, performers in the United States, whoever is being called up, is of two minds. It's very difficult for a European-based coach, a European-based player, someone who understands how a quality coaching staff prepares for a game, to look at Bruce Arena and say, well, this guy doesn't know his head from the hole in the wall. European players are used to much better, and some of them are used to best. I mean, Pulisic played for Thomas Tuchel. I think he got the very end of Jurgen Klopp, but he was in the youth team then. So the Europeans are used to good coaches. They come here and they see the stupidity that emanates from MLS, whether it's Arena or Dave Sarakin, and it makes them want to throw up. They don't want that. They realize that they're being sold down the river. They're being sold down the river in order to placate MLS owners. And from that point of view, they become disillusioned with the entire U.S. soccer scene, with the entire U.S. soccer setup. Jeff Cameron put out in the article that Bruce Arena wasn't a good coach, and Bruce Arena called him a bad egg. Well, and Bruce Arena lied about Jeff Cameron not being fit, which was, verified line, even though the media didn't cover him, because Jeff Cameron played for Stoke a week before and a week after, so he wasn't perfectly fine form. Well, at least as it concerns him, he was not exactly, Frank Lampard or that Conte guy, Godou Conte. So when you have a player who sees the coach lie to him, whether it's private or public, you can't help but develop a horribly negative attitude toward not only the team, and you have some teammates, but also toward the organization. And then you're not motivated. Then you're saying, what point is there to fly to the United States if the coach is an idiot? What's worse, not only is he an idiot, he's a lying, cheating, son of a, whatever. And the clubs, where there is an open competition, a coach like that just simply doesn't last. A coach who lies doesn't last. A coach on whom his players who can be relied on, in other words, he's a flake, is no good. Yet the United States soccer bosses, Sunil Gulati, Don Garber, managed to install Bruce Arena as their head coach. And that brings you to a deeper question, to somewhere where I started a half hour ago. And that is that the problem isn't Bruce Arena. Bruce Arena is just a symptom of incompetence in the Gulag Boys network, where the mediocrity is recirculated or recircled before it goes down the drain, like the U.S. team did in Trinidad and Tobago. The problem is that the people who are in charge, United States Soccer Federation, or people who represent the most significant constituencies, don't have American national interests at heart. In other words, they want to make their money, they want to promote their private interests at the expense of the national team. Now, that leads to the whole debacle. And the debacle, of course, leads back to MLS, because now you can put a team, local coaches, local players, and they suck. They lost to Trinidad and Tobago, which is a 100-ranked team by FIFA or ELA or whatever. But, they're playing B-side, so they're really like just a bunch of amateurs barely fit to be in the top 200. So for them to lose to a team that's like, just completely worthless bunch of, non-performers, with the exception of Jovin Jones, who's in Bundesliga 2 now, is a remarkable failure. Remarkable failure. Now, let's give MLS some credit. It did manage to adjust its financial structure by allowing individual owners to essentially pay off budget, with a limited cap charge, and to a whole bunch of various imported players. So that's a good thing. More imported players will mean that crappy coaches will be found out. In other words, it's okay if everybody has crappy coaches and crappy players, then it's pretty much all the same. It looks like garbage. When you're starting better players, better quality coaches who know their X's and O's, who know their fundamentals, will be able to get better results. And that will drive the worst, career MLS Americans out of the game. The best one, the good ones will stay. The worst one will be driven out. New imported coaches will be brought in, and in fact have been brought in. And that also gives MLS another step up. Better players, better coaches, more money spent. That's good. In fact, that is great. But that is not where MLS stood before. And for whatever reason, Don Garber, the MLS commissioners and MLS owner whom he represented, the Bob Krafts and Phil Anschutz and the Merritt Paulsons, were dead set on hiring an American coach regardless of his qualifications. And they convinced themselves that a coach who failed miserably in 2006 and a coach that failed miserably on the international scene with LA Galaxy, despite having a lot more money. In other words, he didn't come close to justifying his payroll on CONCACAF Champions League. They somehow convinced themselves that that sort of a player, that sort of a coach, was the one who was needed to take him to the World Cup. They didn't even go out and hire some semi-retired European who just kind of look around and say, I'm take this job for $1 million. I have experience. There are a lot of older coaches who are very, Jupp Heynckes was brought on by Bayern out of retirement. He's 72 years old. He probably could have taken, he may not have taken the job considering he knows Klinsmann. But he might have taken the job, and there are other retired coaches who had success on the international scene whom they could have hired. But no, they did not want to hire an international coach. They want to hire Bruce Arena. They want to hire only the best American. Now, I'll add that at the very same time that Bruce Arena got hired by USSR, by US national soccer team, Bob Bradley was hired by Swansea, based on the same premise. Swansea City owners are American. Of course, the club was in the Premier League. And they thought, well, a coach is a coach. We'll bring the Bob Bradley. Bob Bradley is a quality, coach. He coaches the US soccer team. We'll do well with Bob Bradley. Bob Bradley was just getting, his last 3 matches, he was being blown out of, stadium by some really, really mediocre team. West Ham, and, he lost to, some other team that were also ranked. And so the owners quickly realized that, hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake, and you cannot, with all their inclinations to hire American, they don't want to hire American like Bob Bradley, so let him go. And so what happened with the U.S. soccer team, the U.S. Federation, is that realized that Bradley and Arena, who are old friends, are really two birds of the same flock. They're not good. And the problem is the United States Soccer Federation and Sunil Gulati and Don Garber didn't get to fire Bruce Arena in time. They didn't get to it in time. And of course, given the qualifications, it's understood that they went to the final match with a fairly reasonable chance of qualifying. And even though the Americans weren't playing well, I mean, 1-1 tie at Panama, 1-1 tie in Honduras, 0-2 loss at Costa Rica, really weren't showing a team that was ready to compete on the global stage, but they didn't make a move because they felt it was too late. Or they felt totally happy, we'll lose to Costa Rica, no big deal, let's go on. Well, here's a plane flying outside. In any case, so the Continental Divide, the divide between Europeans and American-based players, is a major problem right now. Jeff Cameron said it, Christian Pulisic said that, Daniel Williams said that. And whoever the next coach is, and whoever the next manager is, whoever the next technical director is, whoever the next, or the current, into the future, head of the United States is, that problem has to be solved. I believe that if the United States hires American coach like Peter Vermes, that the problem is going to get worse. European players will begin to tune American team out, American-based players. The league will lose respect. The United States team will lose respect. The players will be more interested in making money, and they will not be all thrilled to fly back to play in these, rinky-dink places like Guatemala and El Salvador or Jamaica, which could be really nice if you're in Montego Bay. And in any case, I think it's a big problem. Somebody has to be able to deal with it. It's hard to tell if anybody wants to, and even worse, it's hard to tell that if many people will acknowledge that there is a problem. With problems, it needs to be first acknowledged and then dealt with. If you don't think you have a problem, you really have a problem. Bye.